Good morning and good evening and good day, depending on where you're tuning in from today. Thank you very much for joining the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, USCRI, on this wonderful day. And thank you for joining in and tuning into our panel event, Examining Continued Protection Concerns for Rohingya Refugees. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I would like to provide some background on the Rohingya refugee crisis for those of us who might not be as familiar with this topic. And it's a brief 2-minute video, so I will go to that right. It seems like you can't hear my sound, so let me try and fix that really quick. Share screen. Media player. All right.
As some of you may know, Bangladesh has hosted Rohingya refugees since the 1970s. Beginning in the late 1980s, violence and discrimination against the Rohingya became frequent, fueled by the narrative that they were part of a relatively recent, distinct social group that did not belong in contemporary Myanmar. As a result, by 2017, around 300,000 Rohingya were living in refugee camps in Bangladesh, some of which had been established as early as 1991. The crisis escalated in late August and early September 2017, when over 700,000 Rohingya fled from attacks launched by Myanmar's military forces, the Tatmadaw, marking the largest and fastest influx into Bangladesh to date. For many Rohingya communities, August 25th is recognized as the anniversary of these horrific events. The U.S. government later determined that these attacks by the Myanmar military targeting ethnic Rohingya constituted genocide and crimes against humanity. Although the Bangladeshi government continues to view repatriation as the main durable solution, active negotiations about repatriation ceased in February 2021, when the Tatmadaw carried out a coup against the Myanmar government. The coup worsened displacement trends in a country that had already been the source of one of the most serious refugee crises in the world. Since then, thousands have fled their homes and have been internally displaced as the Tatmadaw clashes with armed ethnic groups and other resistance organizations. This is in addition to the more than 1 million Rohingya who remain in refugee camps across the border in Bangladesh since the influx of 2017. While Myanmar and Bangladesh have resumed talks about repatriating Rohingya refugees, NGOs and advocates remain skeptical and understand that Rohingya refugees cannot return with safety or dignity if Myanmar is unwilling to accept them as full citizens and continues to inflict violence against them.
At this time, I would like to introduce you all to our wonderful panelists. First, we have Abdul Hamid. Hamid is the Refugee Congress delegate for Wisconsin. Belonging to the Rohingya ethnic group, he came to the United States in 2015. Hamid is the founding president of the Rohingya Society in Malaysia and a founding member of United Stateless. He is a vocal supporter of his people. Hamid graduated in 1994 with a degree in chemistry from the University of Yangon and continued his studies in Malaysia, where he earned a Doctor of Philosophy in the field of phytochemistry from the University of Science, Malaysia. However, he did not get a chance to work in Malaysia because he was not able to obtain a valid Myanmar passport. And then we have John Quinley III. John is the director for Fortify Rights. His work focuses on supporting Rohingya human rights defenders and documenting human rights violations in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Previously, he worked with the Women's Opportunities Resource Center in the United States and Partners Relief and Development in Myanmar. John holds a Master's of Arts from Nottingham University in the UK. He also holds a graduate certificate from the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University and the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies in Canada. And then we have Dr. Nahreen Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed is a Bangladeshi American ICU doctor based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She is currently faculty in the Division of Critical Care at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania and the medical director at MedGlobal, an NGO which works in crisis and conflict zones to improve access to healthcare for refugee communities and communities in hard-to-reach areas, such as Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, Ukraine, Gaza, Ecuador, Colombia, and Bangladesh and Yemen. She's actually joining us from Colombia today. She has worked directly with the Rohingya community in Bangladesh, where MedGlobal has had a presence since the escalation in 2017, and with refugee communities in Syria, Lebanon, and throughout Latin America. And then we have James Rodehaver. James has served as the chief of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Myanmar team since January 2020. A human rights professional with over 27 years of experience, James has previously headed the UN's Commission of Inquiry on Syria, the Human Rights Unit of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and the OSCE's Human Rights Field Components in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. He graduated from Ohio University and the Washington and Lee University School of Law. He has been honored as a notable alumni of Ohio University in the United States and an honorary fellow of the Nottingham University Human Rights Law Center. And then I, Aaron Nujimian-Escajeda, policy analyst at USCRI, will be moderating this panel. I started at USCRI in 2021 and continue to advocate for the rights and protections of Rohingya refugees, survivors of human trafficking, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable populations worldwide. I visited Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in December 2022 and published a glimpse at camp life in Cox's Bazar, examining aid response and distilling solutions, a report on the situation in Rohingya in Bangladesh in April 2023. Food insecurity is one of many challenges that contribute to larger protection concerns. Owing to inadequate funding, the World Food Program, or WFP, reduces general food assistance from $12 to $8 per person per month, which calculates to around only 27 cents per day. We will now turn to a brief media clip that discusses the ration cuts and security concerns, which will lead us into our larger discussion on the continued protection concerns for Rohingya refugees.
The cuts to food aid have been coupled with an increase in violence in the refugee camps. Human rights activists fear that security will be further destabilized.
The food aid cut by the WFP is inhumane and disrespectful to Rohingya refugees. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other forms of crimes like murder, banditry, and extortion could increase in the camps as a result.
Lawlessness has already taken its toll on the refugees. Bangladeshi investigators say that the massive fire that left thousands of refugees homeless earlier this month was carried out by criminal gangs trying to establish supremacy in the camps. For Hamida, Fire is just one more problem that she must bear as a refugee.
We live in fear in the camp. We fear that our tents could be set on fire. We have gas stoves inside our tents, which could also cause a fire. We fear somebody could set fires on purpose. Beatings and killings have also been taking place here. But what can we do about it? Where can we go with the small kids?
The choices are stark. Bangladesh has been negotiating with Myanmar for refugee repatriation, but the two past attempts failed. Most refugees fear more for their safety back home, even more than they fear the dangers of the camps.
As we heard in the video, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other forms of crime may increase in Rohingya refugee camps as a result of the ongoing food aid cuts by the WFP. When I visited Cox's Bazar in December 2022, I spoke with an elderly Rohingya couple whose son had been kidnapped by a gang and was being held for ransom. The elderly man said, "There's nothing left for me. I lived as a refugee, and I don't want that for my children or grandchildren." He also alluded that many Rohingya have left Cox's Bazar by boat due to the deteriorating camp conditions. John, can you talk to us about the protection concerns that you and Fortify Rights have observed for Rohingya in Bangladesh and the dangers that Rohingya face in trying to leave Cox's Bazar as they attempt to enter different countries in the region?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel today, and it's an honor to speak alongside the other panelists. As everyone knows, in the video said, it's been 6 years since the genocidal attack against the Rohingya by the Myanmar military. And I think that's essential to note that Rohingya in Rakhine State are still facing ongoing genocide. And on August 24th, tomorrow, the junta is supposed to file their counter memorial to the International Criminal Court around their provisional measures. But we've found that the junta is still breaking those provisional measures, and restrictions are still in place in Rakhine State for Rohingya every day. And that includes their ability to self-identify or to be citizens. Here in Bangladesh, Rohingya face a kind of a Madrid of protection concerns, both from the Bangladeshi government and restrictions imposed by the authorities, and also, like the video alluded to, by non-state actors in the camps. So although Bangladesh welcomed, close to 1 million refugees 6 years ago now, they're also restricting refugees' everyday lives. So refugees in Cox's Bazar are not able to access work opportunities, move about freely, or access formal education in any widespread manner. We recently also documented and found that members of the Armed Police Battalion, known as APBN, these are police that are meant to protect refugees in the camps, are actually detaining, arresting, and torturing Rohingya refugees while systematically demanding corrupt payments that amount to extortion against them. We've also, in the last few years since the assassination of the late Mohibullah, documented murders of Rohingya refugees by militant groups and other criminal gangs, and these have increased significantly this year. This includes, we documented quite in detail the murder of Abdul, a refugee community leader, earlier this year. On top of murders, we've documented from eyewitnesses and survivor testimony torture, abductions, gender-based violence, threats, and intimidation by militant groups in the camps. This would include groups like the Arkan Rohingya Salvation Army, known as ARSA, Rohingya Solidarity Organization, known as RSO, Muna Group, and other militant and criminal gangs. The reality is Rohingya are genocide survivors and deserve protection in Bangladesh. So I think some of the things that the Bangladesh government can do, and UNHCR and other global leaders, is to first fully investigate the assassination of Mohibola and other Rohingya Majis that have been murdered in the camps, hold those responsible to account. This includes under international fair trial standards. So even those that are accused of these crimes should be treated fairly in the Bangladeshi courts. Also, UNHCR in Bangladesh should expand their network of protective spaces for Rohingya refugees that are at risk. And lastly, Bangladesh should work and has already actually done a lot of work to start resettling refugees that have acute protection concerns to third country places, because some refugees here in Bangladesh are not able to safely live here any longer. So those are just some recommendations we have that could kind of start protecting refugees today. Happy to also answer questions during the question and answer time.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing that perspective with us. I now want to turn to Dr. Ahmed. When I visited the Rohingya refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, I spoke with doctors from Friendship NGO who said that there was an outpouring of international support and aid after the 2017 influx, which allowed for the creation of health centers. However, they also mentioned that limited resources created tension between the older refugees and the newly arrived ones. And Dr. Ahmed, in your experience with MedGlobal, how does access to healthcare play into protection concerns? How does mental health play into this? And does limited mobility affect people's mental health?
Thank you for that question. You know, it's really something to go and spend time in the camps and get to speak to the community. I have been there several times, shortly after the initial escalation and a few times after that in the last few years. And, you know, it's very clear, as you mentioned, that influx that happened in the beginning. But over time, as funding has gone down, as the Rohingya have left the media cycle and the attention has gone down, you're seeing the conditions worsening. And, you know, poor access to nutrition, inadequate living conditions, inadequate access to health, inadequate access to water, clean water, sanitation, hygiene, those are all determinants of insecurity. And often those can be factors of why someone might feel desperate enough to engage in violent crime, illicit drug trade, why rates of GBV are increasing. I mean, this is, you know, when people have limited mobility, they're in crowded areas, and where there's this feeling of overall hopelessness and there's a need to survive, there is so much that can happen in that. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of this escalation within the camps. And so healthcare really provides a significant part in this. And the reason is because providing access to healthcare provides dignity. It provides pathways to referral for gender-based violence. It provides a way to screen children for whether they're in safe spaces. It provides access to extremely needed mental health support services. And, you know, again, to the point of limited mobility, when it comes to the relationship of limited mobility and mental health, those two are intricately related. You know, various surveys have been conducted to just hear a little bit about the stressors of the day-to-day life. You know, that's outside of the horrific atrocities that this community has undergone that has led to post-traumatic stress disorder due to the targeted ethnic cleansing that's happened. And not only that, but then, you know, all of these ongoing violence to the community and the fact that they don't have any pathway towards resources within Bangladesh, all of that put together on top of the day-to-day stressors of lack of livelihood, lack of access to education. These are all things that really are a part of why there's such a widespread prevalence of depression, anxiety, psychosis, suicidal ideation, and even violent crime. And these are things that are all intricately related. You know, addressing land, property, housing rights, enhancing access to gainful employment, you know, these are all ways, and education especially, these are all clear ways in which some of these stressors can be addressed. But, you know, as John mentioned, there really also needs to be additional support from the Bangladeshi government and from the international world of NGOs and humanitarian aid that really steps up, that advocates the need for all of these things. And these are all basic human rights. And taking these away from a group that have already undergone what they have is truly criminal, I feel. And, you know, I think it's important that as a healthcare provider and as a part of a healthcare NGO, that's the part that we can contribute and the part that we can advocate for and the part that healthcare plays in sustaining some of these protection rights.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, in my visit to Cox's Bazar also, I spoke with one of the doctors from Friendship NGO, and he mentioned that it's also a cultural shift that for many refugees that are in crisis mode, they don't understand that the effects or the side effects or the impacts of trauma are things that can actually be addressed. So it's a lot of educating the population and helping them understand that this is something that you can have help for, whether it be through, you know, medication or therapy or some other type of treatment or.
Yeah, absolutely. And overcoming some of those barriers and perceptions of healthcare for the community is also a part of what many of, you know, much of the work that we do also includes counseling, things like that, just about what services are available. But again, you know, we are really limited by the current funding, decline in funding rather, and how that has affected the healthcare services that are available.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And thank you for your perspective and for the work that you do. Now I'd like to turn to James. In your position at OHCHR, what do you see as the main protection concerns that Rohingya face in Myanmar today? Can you also talk a bit about the concerns they face when trying to leave Myanmar and go to other countries in the region? And how do these differ for different populations, such as women, children, and people with disabilities?
Thank you very much for the questions and for the chance to be able to address this group. I mean, as John said earlier, it's a real honor to be sharing a screen with such a distinguished group, and certainly have been very much looking forward to this discussion. Now, the problem with protection with the Rohingya is that their protection concerns are always acute in Rakhine State, probably now more than ever. You know, it's rather a perverse situation right now that Rakhine State is one of the more stable and secure parts of the country where there's very little fighting, but yet you know, the situation for Rohingya is not improved at all. In fact, it's gotten horrifically worse, particularly since Cyclone Mocha in May this year. You know, but you know, insecurity is always just a step away. I mean, there is a peaceful situation in Rakhine State in terms of the lack of armed conflict, but that's because there's a ceasefire in place between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military. And that ceasefire has been in place since November of last year, and it's very tenuous. Now, in the periods where there have been fighting between the Arakan army and the Myanmar military, one of the factors that you see is that neither side takes a lot of care towards protecting civilians, particularly Rohingya civilians. And in fact, there were several times during the periods of fighting between August and November last year where both the Arakan army and the Myanmar military would actually take up positions to shell the other military force by locating just outside of Rohingya villages, so that any fire that would come into them would first impact Rohingya villages. So, you know, it's clear that neither side is particularly concerned about protecting the security of Rohingya. Now, in terms of other major security concerns, you have you know, the persistent lack of free movement for Rohingya. You know, most of the Rohingya are either living in, as I say, very marginalized villages in the north and in north central Rakhine State, or they are living in IDP camps where they've been, you know, some as long as since 2012. About 150,000 or so are located in IDP camps. Now, regardless of whether you're in an IDP camp or in a village, you have very little freedom of movement. The IDP camps are almost akin to detention camps because people are not allowed to move freely outside. You have to have a special travel authorization to leave the IDP camp, and very few get those authorizations. For people living in villages, they have to have special permission to leave their township. So what this does is it makes it extremely difficult for them to move. It makes them very difficult to find work or to leave for economic opportunities. It makes it very difficult for them to go and to tend fields or to seek food. So as a result, they have persistent humanitarian needs. It also makes it very difficult for them to go to school or just seek out educational opportunities. So they're basically stuck. Now, since the coup, another factor that has greatly increased their insecurity are that Rohingya who take a chance and travel unlawfully or without authorization have been increasingly arrested. When they're caught, they are arrested and then put on trial. And so, just last year, for example, there were over 3,000 Rohingya arrested, 671 of which were children. And nearly 2,000 of them were put on trial and convicted. Out of those, about 417 were children, and they were charged with violations either of the Immigration Act or with the Resident Registration Act. So, they're facing prison terms of anywhere from 2 to 4 years in most cases. And so it's dangerous for them even to try and leave the areas around where they're forced to live. Those who do or are able to make it out, they often attempt to leave by sea, which is, of course, extremely dangerous proposition. Over 5,300 Rohingya just last year were known to have undertaken sea voyages trying to leave either Bangladesh and from the Cox's Bazar area or from Rakhine State to get to Malaysia, to Thailand, to other places where they could seek protection. It's known that over 439 have either died or are missing as a result of taking those sea voyages. There's another number that also are missing where it's unknown whether they made it to their sea voyage or not. So again, it's a very risky proposition to try and travel. Now, as I said earlier, another major concern is the fact that Rohingya are so restricted in their movement that many of them just remain persistently in need of humanitarian assistance because of the lack of economic opportunities, because of the lack of the ability to either work or maintain, agricultural, fields or other opportunities. So they're very food insecure. And of course, it's very difficult for them to get sustained medical care. Now, one of the things that makes this extremely difficult at this time in particular is that, first of all, the Myanmar military has been undertaking a dramatic clampdown on the activities of humanitarian organizations since their coup d'etat. They've been making the operation of humanitarian civil society organizations very, very difficult. Humanitarians are having a very difficult time getting aid into the country, and then even more difficult getting access to the areas where people are most in need. Then, to make it even worse, in May of this year, when Cyclone Mocha hit Rakhine State and devastated in the areas that were affected by the cyclone, over 90% of existing infrastructure was badly damaged or destroyed. Almost every single roof of a house or shelter in those cyclone-affected areas was ripped off or destroyed. So shelter was devastated, and it is known that over 116 Rohingya died in that cyclone. Now, what the military has done since the cyclone is, first of all, they clamped down on information. They have threatened anyone who reports on the number of deaths or on humanitarian needs. They've threatened them with prosecution. They, in the run up to the cyclone's landfall, there was of course, first of all, there was a grave mistrust of the military. So people did not want to rely on the military for information, particularly the Rohingya. The military in the vast majority of cases gave no warnings to the local population. Particularly the Rohingya that are stuck in IDP camps, they have very few fixed or hard shelters. So there's very little support or shelter that they could find from a powerful storm. Since there's no freedom of movement, they weren't allowed to run, to flee to higher ground. And of course, most of the Rohingya camps and many of the villages are in areas that are prone and most vulnerable to natural disasters. Many of those settlements are in floodplains and in other areas that are vulnerable. So again, they face a number of protection concerns, and it was made worse after the cyclone because not only did the military prevent them from seeking shelter before the cyclone, but then afterwards, they have been preventing the rebuilding of shelters in IDP camp facilities. They've been denying the international community and humanitarian organizations from doing needs assessments or from accessing or delivering humanitarian assistance to cyclone-affected areas. They've been instead demanding that they be recognized as legitimate and aid only be delivered through the military. It's an extremely acute and difficult security and protection concern situation that they face. The last thing I would say is that those Rohingya that are able to make it out of the country, and again, whether it be women, children, the disabled, first of all, those journeys are extremely difficult, and since movement is very limited, it's even more difficult, particularly for children and the disabled. But then those who are able to successfully make it to countries in the region, very few of them ever find solace or protection. There is very little offered in terms of urgent or emergency protection, and oftentimes it's very short-lived. In many cases, boats are turned away, even if they do make it close to the shore of certain member states in the area. So it is an extremely difficult situation. The last thing I would say is that there's one last comment I would make, and in that Deutsche Welle clip that you showed that showed such a stark situation in Bangladesh, it brought up the situation of the repatriation process that's being negotiated or discussed between Bangladesh, and it says they're negotiating with Myanmar. And I keep hearing this, that ASEAN is speaking to Myanmar. Some member states are reaching out to Myanmar. No, they're not. They are reaching out to the Myanmar military. They are not the legitimate government of the country. They are the people that displaced the Rohingya and have targeted them over the last decade repeatedly. They are not a legitimate or credible actor to be negotiating with. And I really think that needs to be stressed above all, because that at the heart of it is the key protection concern that the Rohingya face. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for sharing that very complete overview of the many different challenges and protection concerns that Rohingya face, not only in Myanmar, but in Bangladesh and throughout the region. I think any of these topics that you all spoke on, all of our speakers spoke on, whether it be access to healthcare or limited mobility in camps or the military junta, we can talk for those for so much more time than we have today. But these challenges, all of them highlight the need for durable solutions, such as resettlement to a third country. And now I want to turn to Hamid. Hamid, can you please share with us your experience with the resettlement process to the United States and the challenges that Rohingya continue to face here?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Aaron, and distinguished panelists. Yeah, resettlement process is a kind of tedious and very long process. For example, if a refugee is an individual registered with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, after you apply for the refugee status, you have to wait for a couple of years. Then you have an interview, it's called RSD, Refugee Status Determination. Then if you are eligible, if you are vulnerable enough, you can apply for your refugee status for resettlement to a third country. Then there's an interview done by the Refugee Support Center. You call it sometimes Durable Solution Unit. And then you have to wait for many years, for 2 or 3 years. In my case, I have to wait for, I was refugee since 2004, and I resettled in 2015. It means I have to get more than 1 decade to wait for resettle to the third country. Because there's what is called as resettlement countries also works as multiple government agencies work together. It's a very tedious process. For example, in the United States, if you apply for refugee status, if they are taking the refugees, the multiple government agencies has to work together, like a DHS, Department of Homeland Security. You have to thoroughly check background, and also they have to work with the U.S. Refugee Admission Program, and the department. This is also one of the government agencies taking refugees, and the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Together, all those things take many years, and you have a refugee has to wait for that. So then we have immigration interview. Let's say if you are resettling to United States, the immigration of the United States goes to the Malaysia, they conduct an interview to the refugees. Then is coming medical checkup, IOM is coming there. IOM is a stand for International Organization for Migration. They are the one who arrange all pre-departure process, medical checkups, including cultural orientations, and travel arrangement. They are the one who does this. But the whole entire process, after you become a mandated refugee, from to resettle to a third country, it's case by case. For some people, it take 10 years. For some people, it take 4 to 5 years. For some, even in 3 years. It depends on the vulnerability of the individual cases. So this is the kind of overall process of the resettlement process for a refugee to resettle to a third country. So as what are the challenges we face as a refugee when you come in a new country? As we know, we all of us know, moving in a new country is very isolating and overwhelming, and few belongings. Their needs are a lot tremendous. Their needs are many. They need housing, schooling for school, and documentation, and also navigating healthcare systems and navigating the transportation system has become very challenging. For example, refugees, Rohingya refugees, those who are resettled in the United States, the major problem is language barrier, because this is the one most what is called refugees are facing challenges to access to the resources to navigate the systems in here. The language is the main problem. And also they are facing a problem that enrolling the children to school, because parents are lack of knowledge and they don't know how to navigate a school system. And when the refugee came here, but refugees resettlement agencies helped them for 3 to 4 months only. That's 3 to 4 months is not enough for the new people, these people. In this 3 to 4 months, what they did is they find the house for them, for shelter, and they apply for the documentation, and they enroll their children to a school, and they give a cash support for 3 or 4 months. Then they have to find a job. The refugee has to find a job, and they have to be independent. They have to navigate all their system their own. So this become very challenging for refugees. I'm talking about perspective for Rohingya, because these people, Rohingya people, are not or get the chance to study in refugee hosting countries, like let's say in Malaysia. I came from Malaysia. There's no proper schooling. You cannot access to the government school. The children over there, you can say illiterate, they didn't get the chance to go to school. And also the parents are also works illegally over there. They are also very limited resources. They came here just because of that illiteracy rate is high in refugee population. They face challenges when you move to the third country. So this is the major challenges we are facing now. Even in one family, the children are very fast to catch the language within 1 or 2 years, 3 years times. The children speaks English very fluently, but they forget Rohingya language. And the noise facing problem in between the family members as well. Even parents and the children's communication become, we can say, it's not what it's called healthy communication. Is sometimes it's a problem. They don't understand their culture. So children are adopting the new culture very, what is called, very fast. But the first generation parents are they're lagging behind. This is there's some kind of challenging facing in the first generation, is we can say the parents are facing. And on top of that, all the family members here living here, they have their family members living in IDP camps in Sitwe, and there's living people in refugee camps in Bangladesh. They have to some kind of support to them. They also, this is extra stress for them. It's on top of they have experienced a trauma in hosting country, let's say in Malaysia. This genocide problem is become more burden for the refugee communities who are living in the third country, because they have to take care of their relatives or their kids and about they are living in Bangladesh camp. So all those are challenges we are facing. Although we are facing challenges, we have seen some advice or heard some positive one in refugee communities in here in America. Let's say I live in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. So we have here about 1,000 families, Rohingya families. I estimated that. Some people estimated more than that. So almost 30 to 40% of the people bought the houses. I think 400, 500 houses we bought. We have 10 grocery stores, and we have 30 to 40 students going to college, and there's a high school students, but it's improving gradually, but it's very challenging. The challenges is tremendous, but people are go through patiently here.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hamid, for sharing that the ongoing challenges with individuals or Rohingya in third countries, whether it be in the region, Malaysia and Thailand, but also here in the United States. I'm happy to hear that there are some improvements in people in Wisconsin going to school, whether it be college or high school. But there are continue to face those other issues, like you said, the pre-literate nature of the population, as well as the issues of access to work authorization and being able to work legally in those different countries. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Now I want to hear briefly from each of the panelists before we go into our Q&A session, to talk briefly about the potential solutions or anything they see as a potential solution to the many challenges discussed today. I would like to first start with John.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I focused mostly on Bangladesh in my remarks, but I would just echo what James said about ending the Myanmar military. They're the main perpetrators of the violations against the Rohingya. They're the ones that are stripping the Rohingya of their ability to become citizens. The new national unity government, although not perfect, they're a lot more inclusive to Rohingya people. And there's potential ways forward and creating an actual government that's providing equality amongst all the different ethnicities in Myanmar. For Bangladesh, I think the authorities should firstly roll out their formal education program. There's a small pilot project right now for Myanmar-based curriculum, but there's thousands upon thousands of Rohingya children and youth that could access formal education in the camps. The Bangladeshi authorities shut down home and private-based education initiatives in the camps and restricted those. They should not restrict those Rohingya-led schools. So those are quite easy wins for Dhaka. You know, they can just allow formal education, they can allow home-based education that are really led and spearheaded by the Rohingya community. Also, Bangladesh authorities have become a lot more open to the idea of third country resettlement. You know, there's basically a hold on resettlement from Bangladesh kind of since 2010. There's a small trickle, but most recently they've really opened it up. So there's like a proper program that the US government has been doing in small numbers. Canada is also doing some numbers. And so I see a willingness amongst Bangladeshi officials to kind of open up that those programs. And so that's a really positive step. And I guess we would just push them to do more and also to collaborate with UNHCR and those like-minded governments more. Yeah.
I think that's great to hear, because I know some of the submitted questions were actually on exit permission and how that's kind of a barrier for individuals or Rohingya to be resettled or to go to other countries. So I think that's good to hear that Bangladesh is a little bit more open to that recently.
Yeah. But Bangladesh is a lot more open to it, and it's really good to see it, particularly in the last year. In India, you know, there's large refugee populations there that are being indefinitely detained. We just released research on indefinite detention of Rohingya refugees, and we spoke to 3 currently detained. The Indian government is being a lot more strict with issuing exit permits, even for people that have letters from governments that are willing to bring them. You know, they have letters from the Canadian government willing to bring them to Canada for resettlement, and the Indian authorities are not allowing those exit permits. So you know, there's some governments in the regions that aren't doing as good as Bangladesh.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that insight. Someone submitted a question exactly on that, on exit visas from India. Now I'd like to hear from Dr. Ahmed.
Yeah, so my focus and expertise is mainly in the healthcare side of things, and so I'll just speak to that. You know, I think seeing the number of INGOs decrease their level of support, you know, I certainly see that there are changes in priority that are happening, but I think there needs to be a collective approach to ensuring that basic primary care and secondary and tertiary level care are available. You know, this is a protracted crisis, and so healthcare, we're not talking about emergency response to trauma injuries only, which is what we saw in the very beginning of the escalation of the crisis, but we're talking about mental health, primary healthcare access, and these are things that in the interim, while everything else is hopefully being worked on and sorted out from a policy level, from a access level, you know, basic human rights of healthcare is essential. And I think so that also means that opening up access to host community healthcare facilities would ideally be great. You know, I understand the concerns with that, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but access to higher level of care for the Rohingya community that are suffering from long-term consequences of non-communicable diseases like heart disease, lung disease, things like that, that requires a level of care that just does not exist fully in the way that it should in the camps. And so having access to these, or at least allowing for effective rebuilding or building of health infrastructure, I think is truly important to ensure that healthcare is accessible, and accessible in a way that provides dignity to the community.
Yeah, and I think someone also submitted a question beforehand on that topic. What do you see as some of the primary mental health considerations of those working with Rohingya populations after they've been resettled? So when they've come to the United States or other third countries, what are some of the primary mental health or health issues that needs to be considered?
Yeah, this is a great question. You know, I mean, the mental health issues that this community are facing are really layered. I mean, there's the history of serial ethnic cleansing that has been happening. It's not just from the 70s. I mean, this dates back much before that, and just the generational trauma that comes from that. So that's number one. And when we think about communities, even in the U.S. and in other parts of the world that have undergone generational trauma, we see a lot of substance use disorder. We see a lot of anxiety, depression, suicidal attempt, physical self-harm, things like that. And those are things that really are an acute priority when we're talking about generational trauma and PTSD as the acute emergent mental health issues in this community. After that, then you're taking a community that maybe is leaving a camp where they've lived, and this is anywhere from children, adolescents to adults, where they've maybe lived for 5, 10 years, depending on what generation they are. And you're dealing with the trauma that comes from living in a camp and the issues that they have experienced there. And so those are just the two, very, very deep mental health issues that need to be addressed. And then after that, there's the concern of abandonment and the risk of safety, and the risk and the security risks that people feel. Generally, we saw it in the clip. The woman explained that on a daily basis, they're feeling fear. What that does to somebody's nervous system and their physical self, physical health and mental health are very linked. And anytime I practice medicine in the Rohingya camp seeing patients, many of the symptoms that I see are actually very much related to severe depression and anxiety, and their somatic complaints. And this is really serious because, that means that we're not addressing their mental health. And these are things that are going to carry over when people are resettling into other parts of the world, even though it may be safer for them to be there. That acute trauma response will be there and will be there for a while. So I think the advice I would give is that this is not a one-time counseling session. This is long-term counseling. This is mental health support that will be required for a lifetime.
Yes, I see, John, you have your hand up if you wanted to add something to that point.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo, we released a participatory research study back in 2020 on mental harm as an act of genocide. And it looked at those daily stressors and post-traumatic stress disorder and kind of those major mental health problems that are coming from the atrocities that happened in Rakhine State and also continuing in Bangladesh. Andrew Riley, who I think is on the call, was the lead author of that report. So I'm happy to circulate that research. It's a participatory study in the comments on mental health stressors.
Yeah, that would be great if you could share that with me, and then I could send it out to everyone who participated in today's panel. That'd be perfect. And as you've all seen, we've broken into the Q&A a little bit, but I want to go back to hear from James on some of the solutions that he sees that could hopefully improve this situation.
Well, I wish I had something really nice and succinct to say, but the situation's only going to be resolved whenever there are conditions conducive to sustainable return, to really voluntary dignified returns for the Rohingya population to the villages they originated from in Myanmar. And yet, right now, there have been none of the root causes of the genocide that have been addressed by the military. There is still widespread discrimination. There's a denial of citizenship. Access to healthcare and education is almost completely denied, and they don't have the opportunity to work or to move freely. As I detailed, I mean, the military still will not use the word Rohingya. They're not even allowed to call themselves Rohingya, and yet this is who right now people are looking to address this problem. No, there are no shortcuts until the Myanmar military is held accountable for the crimes they've committed. There are no easy solutions. So what can be done in the interim? It's some of the things that John has talked about, and Nahreen, Dr. Nahreen has talked about. It is about making sure that humanitarian aid is available to the Rohingya, and whether it be in Bangladesh or inside Myanmar, trying to ensure the international donors are properly funding the humanitarian appeals. Secondly, that there are greater third country resettlement options. And then lastly, when Rohingya are able to move out and to get out, they're doing so at incredible risk. They need that temporary and urgent protection. So the countries of the region need to step up and be more generous in extending that protection. It can't just this can't be a burden just borne by Bangladesh. And so there has to be a greater generosity of spirit in the region.
Thank you for sharing that. And then Hamid, also, can you provide us with some of your insights as to what some of the solutions should be?
Yes. The first thing, the Rohingyas, according to my observation, Rohingyas are victims of geopolitics as well. You can see that China, for example, China is back in Myanmar, and also they are selling the guns to the AA for their interest. Whenever we are talking about the refugees repatriation, and the AA say, still we are not ready, that our country is not safe for refugee repatriation state. Because since 2012, we can say that, yes, we have to tackle the root causes of the problem. The problem is not only the government, Myanmar government, junta, and also the problem is the Rakhine community as well for us, because they don't want to share the land of our country with Rohingya. That's why they created the problem in 2012, and they sacrificed a woman called Tidatwe, and all these problems are created with Dr. Amon, all those Rakhine nationalists. They are the one who invited the army to what is called for clearance operations. And this is one thing. And also the pressure of China as interest in the Arakan, and the India interest in our with relationship with the Myanmar government and Arakan also, this contributing all those factors. For example, you can see we have seen refugees before in 1978, and all refugees can repatriate to the country because all Rohingya people has proper documentation. They have citizenship, they are all those proper. Then they change they think about that, what we should do now. They what is called drafted 1982 citizenship law. They want to just eliminate the Rohingya from the citizenship. It goes by the ethnicity law. I call it ethnicity law. It's based on the ethnicity. They drafted it. The three guys who drafted the 1982 citizenship law also, three of them is Rakhine. There's Dr. Ajo, one is called Dr. Ajo, Usantao, and Dr. Amo. Amo became president for 18 days. Yet two of them are Rakhine ethnicity. They are the one targeted Rohingya, what is called, to drive up all the community from the soil of Arakan. This is the major. As long as we don't check up the problem, then we'll be hard to address the issue. I think this is regional politics and Rakhine community, they are not willing to solve the problem. That's right. This is the political will. As soon as they are ready, then the problem will be solved. The problem is from Myanmar side. For example, it's not from Bangladesh side. For example, we are living in the Rakhine community, and Rohingyas living in Arakan, also in Bangladesh. If a Rakhine living in Bangladesh, they are considered citizens, they can be elected, they vote, they have everything, they can participate, their higher education, everything access. If Rakhine goes to this Bangladeshi Rakhine, if one goes to Arakan, they say, yeah, he came to the native land, they welcome him. If a Rohingya is living in Rakhine state, you say you are from Bangladesh. If a Rohingya goes to the Bangladesh, you are not from here, you are from Myanmar, you are from Myanmar. So we are facing some kind of limbo because Rakhines are considered son of the soil, and technically Rohingyas are considered like an alien fall from the sky. We are not belongs to any here, whether in Bangladesh, to Myanmar. So this problem is related to the regional, what is called geopolitics as well. We have to put in this consider to that point as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Hamid. And I know our time is up, and there are a few more questions that we unfortunately won't be able to get to. But I did want to comment on one last question that's in the chat. What can be done from Maine or from other parts of the United States to help the Rohingya community? I think participating in events like this, continuing to raise the awareness and the profile of this issue is very important, because there are unfortunately a lot of humanitarian crises that are competing for our attention right now. But continuing to raise it to your communities as well as your legislators is something that's so important, to let them know that this community is not forgotten. Second, with the Welcome Corps, the second phase of that program, individuals will be able to sponsor specific individuals. So if individuals want to sponsor a Rohingya family member or someone from the Rohingya community, that is set to roll out later this year. And then third, as we've heard often, that there's a lot of underfunding for the situations in Myanmar, for the MOCA relief efforts, for Bangladesh. So if at all able to continue to help support those funds, will also help the Rohingya communities. But thank you very much, everyone, for participating today. Thank you for our wonderful panelists. I've learned so much, and I'm excited, and I feel so much more able to continue this work. And I'm so grateful for all of you joining in today. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.